Hey pals, I'm here today to talk about the books I've read in the last few weeks or so. I have done a triple review video recently for 3 books that I really enjoyed, and they were Penance by Eliza Clark, Tell Me What I Am by In Memoriam, and Ordinary Human Failings by Megan Nolan. So I'll link that review video up above, so if you haven't watched that, I'd recommend checking that out because I really enjoyed all 3 of those. And I will also shortly be doing a standalone review for Carla by Colin Walsh, which I absolutely loved. So these are all the books I read other than those, and they're sort of a mixed bag, and I read these books for a lot of different reasons, but quite a few of these featured in my anticipated releases videos. This first one was an anticipated release for spring, and that is This Family by Kate Sawyer. The premise of this is like nothing really new, but I enjoy family dramas. Particularly I like books that are set across the course of one day, which this was, and that also have the perspectives of lots of different characters, which this does. So the premise is we are following this older woman who is getting remarried, and she's getting remarried in her sort of rural property, which is set in Suffolk, which is where I grew up, and there was lots of references to living in a place like Suffolk after spending a lot of years in London, which I found really enjoyable. And on the day of her remarriage, her ex-husband will be there, her ex-mother-in-law who actually lives with her, and also her 2 daughters and her stepdaughter will all be seeing each other again for the first time in a lot of years because her 2 daughters had this sort of catastrophic falling out. And so the whole book is centred around that day, but it darts loads back to everyone in the family's memories. So you get perspectives from the mother, the ex-husband and father of her children, each of the 3 daughters, and you sort of gradually build this story of why the 2 sisters aren't speaking and why everybody has these sort of moments of awkwardness with one another. This is doing like nothing really new with this type of novel. This is like a really solid family drama. I really enjoyed reading about these characters. In particular, I thought there was a lot of strength in the discussion about the sort of divorced parents and the lives they sort of built as older people and the regrets they had and the sort of level of responsibility they felt they owed to one another even though they were divorced. I thought was quite well handled. I really enjoyed this when I was reading it. I would definitely recommend it if you like the sound of it, but it's not necessarily going to be a book I like really remember or really sticks with me. It's one of those books that is like really enjoyable when you're reading it, really easy to get through, but like, you know, isn't super memorable. Then I think this was for the June book club, I'm losing track now, we read In Memoriam by Alice Wynne. So I started to listen to this one on audio because I'd requested it from the library, but I was quite far along in the queue and I didn't know if it was going to come in time for me to read it for the book club. I started listening audio and I just loved the audiobook. I got to chapter 4 on audio. If you've read this book, you know that chapter 4 is pretty devastating. I was listening to it whilst waiting for a bus and started crying. It was a little bit awkward. So I decided to buy myself a physical copy so I could like read along as well as listening. And I have super mixed feelings about this book. I did quite a long in-depth spoiler review over on my Patreon. We have a book club. I think the book club is in the $2 tier where we read a book each month and have a spoilery discussion, both on our Discord, but then also I do a video. And yeah, I had a really mixed reaction to this, and I think a few people in the book club did as well. I feel like I haven't read a lot of World War novels, so a lot of what made this book really devastating and emotive for me was just the hard facts of what trench warfare was like. I also found the last 100 pages a bit weaker than the start. There's a couple of points in the book that are like a bit unbelievable in terms of the things that happen. And also I know I've heard a lot of people discuss that the way in which queerness is handled in this book, or I guess this sort of social acceptability of queerness, isn't very believable. And I certainly agree with that. Like, so many people in this book know that these 2 men are queer and don't care, and they're just completely accepting, which wouldn't be true for this time period. But I also felt like we're reading a novel that's set during wartime. You know, nearly every character dies. So do we also need, you know, the sort of depressing truth of what it would have been like to, you know, live as a queer man during that time? I don't know. I'm undecided about that. So I feel like this story really got to me, but I think maybe the facts got to me more than the fiction. And I don't think the author's writing style or sort of plotting is anything that amazing. I can completely see this being made into a film, but again, I think it's more for the actual factual content. As well, in the acknowledgements in the back of this book, the author references loads of fictional and factual accounts she sort of borrowed scenes from or was inspired by, and so I was left feeling that if I was more knowledgeable about World War literature, I would find this book completely unoriginal. So I had very mixed feelings about this. Parts of me felt like I adored it, parts of me felt like I was very disappointed in it. So there is that one. Then next, I finally started my rereads, and I was asking a few people what they would rather see with my rereads. I think I've got about 13 rereads planned for the year. I probably will end up reading more, hopefully. And I said, would you rather I speak about them all in just wrap-ups like this, or would you prefer I do sort of grouped videos where I talk about my rereading experience? And people said they would like the group videos, but for me to sort of briefly mention them here. So I'll do that. So I reread A Place for Us by Fatima Farheen Mirza. What I'll say is I originally read this book at a time in my life when something quite difficult happened, and so I put the book down for I think about 6 weeks. And when I came back to the book, I enjoyed it, but I didn't think it was anywhere near as brilliant as I thought everyone else was describing it as. And so it was always one I'd sort of been gutted about, because again, this is a family drama, multiple perspectives, which is just completely something I love. And so quite a few people over the years had kept urging me to come back to this one. I did. I absolutely adored it. I gave it 5 stars. I'm so glad I reread it. And I will talk more about the experience and what this book is actually about in another video. Then I listened to this on audio via Scribd, Margaret and the Mystery of the Missing Body by Megan Milks. I've been wanting to read a book by Megan Milks. I think this is their only novel. I think their other books are either short story collections and maybe they have a non-fiction book. I'm not sure. This was an interesting one. So this was narrated by the author. And so usually I'm someone who doesn't really like mouth sounds in an audiobook, like when you can hear someone swallow or when you can hear their lips touch and things like that. I really don't like that, even though I really like ASMR. I don't know why. And that was the case with this author narrating their book, but I feel like it really worked with this character, because Megan Milks would choose to swallow when you could tell the character was anxious, and so I felt that it really added to the experience. What is this book about? This book is a bit of a book of two halves, okay? Because the book opens and you meet Margaret, who is 17, but she is looking back on the summer of when she was 12 years old, when she had something called Girls Can Solve Anything, which was a mystery club that she was the sort of lead of, and her friendship group sort of investigated these sort of Scooby-Doo type science fiction mysteries. And that's one thing about the book that I was a bit unsure of. They're investigating somebody who seems to be consuming butterflies in order to become one, and the book is written like that's something that could actually happen. So I'm not quite sure if this book is supposed to be sort of sci-fi fantasy, or if you're supposed to just think that this is Margaret describing this to be fantastical so as to sort of make her life more interesting. I think probably the latter. So that's sort of the first half, and you realise that things sort of go wrong in this friendship group, and as a 17-year-old, she's not really sure why. You also realise that she's just really unsure of her body and also how to be around both girls and boys of her age. And then in the second half, there's a really big shift. And I wouldn't usually say this sort of thing in a review, but I'm going to, because it has quite triggering content in it. Margaret has problems with an eating disorder, and so she's sent to a sort of a centre for that, a sort of a ward where she stays with other teenagers who also have problems with eating disorders. And the story is still sort of focused on this mystery element, but becomes much more about how Margaret feels about her body, and there starts to be questions around gender and body dysmorphia. And yeah, so I found this a really interesting book. It's not very plot focused, so I think maybe even though I enjoyed the audiobook, that wasn't necessarily the way to go, because I didn't feel super pulled to get back to the audiobook, and I usually need a bit more encouragement to listen to an audiobook. At the end, there's a section where the author almost inserts themselves and sort of makes you aware that they are an author writing the book, which usually I don't know if it would work, but I think it really did, because they had some things they wanted to get across, and I think it was really important for them to do that. I would definitely read more from this author. This is very unique, and I'll probably remember it because I haven't really read anything else like it. So if you are intrigued by it, I would definitely recommend giving it a go. Then we have Last Summer on State Street by Toya Wolff. I've already spoken about this in a video where I was ranking all my anticipated releases for the first 3 months of the year. So I'll link that above. So I won't spend too long talking about this book. This book is set on State Street in Chicago in the summer of 1999, and we follow this young girl, I think she's around 11 or 12, called Fifi, and her group of 3 friends who come from really different backgrounds. And this is a summer when all the tower blocks they live in are being sort of torn down. So Fifi is really feeling unsure, her life feels really unstable and unknowable, and yeah, she doesn't really feel secure or safe. She doesn't know what's going to happen. Her brother's starting to mix with the wrong crowd, and then one of the friends she's recently made goes missing. And it's about the repercussions of the sort of actions of that summer. And most of the book is set during that summer, and then there is a portion at the end which is Fifi as an adult sort of looking back and commenting on that summer. I enjoyed the section set within the summer. I think if you like coming of age narratives, in particular about young girls, this is done really, really well, and I'll definitely read whatever this author brings out in the future. However, I felt that the author had a lack of trust in the reader to understand what she was trying to get across. So quite often there would be sections where, you know, there was clearly some sort of messaging within the writing, but then the author would just lay it out in a sentence for you, even though you'd already understood it in the preceding paragraphs. And then that became even more apparent in that last chunk where we see Fifi as an adult, because everything's wrapped up so neatly, because the author wants to make sure that you think of everything exactly how she wants you to. And yeah, I just think it shows a bit of a lack of trust. I think this often happens with debut novels, so I'm willing to give this author another go because there were elements of this book and her writing style that I really enjoyed. Then another reread for me was Commonwealth by Anne Patchett. This was the book club pick for my patrons for July. A lot of my patrons had already read this book and wanted to reread it, and a lot of them hadn't read it and it was on their TBR. I read this when it came out in 2015, and I barely remembered anything, so it was a really interesting reread. I initially gave this 4 stars when I read it in 2015, but then I remembered loving it so much that I increased it to 5 stars, which is something I very rarely do. I quite regularly knock ratings down, but never really up. This time round, this is like a 3.5 star read for me. There are elements of this that I love, and there are whole chapters where I think Anne Patchett is a brilliant writer. There's also parts of this where I just think, God, this needed to be such a longer novel to have so many characters, because I feel like a lot of the characters are held at arm's length. There gets to be a point when you get to a chapter with a certain character in a certain timeline, and you're just like, oh, like I'd rather just not waste time with these people because I want to be in the other timeline. So yeah, sort of had mixed reactions. I'll talk about this more in my video about rereads. Then the next 3, I read each of these in one evening. Not 3 of them in one evening, but each of them, I finished work at 5 o'clock and then sat and read them before I went to bed. So they were all very quick reads. The first one is Escape and Control by Steve Hollyman. Now, I'd never heard of this book, but after finishing Penance by Eliza Clark, in fact, after finishing all those books that I mentioned previously that I really enjoyed, I tried to see if there was any author events near me I could go to. And the only one was Eliza Clark is going to be talking in my Waterstones, I think in September. But she's talking with Steve Hollyman, and that's because their books have sort of similar themes. So I thought, okay, I'll look into what his book is about. This is the blurb, because this is a really difficult one to explain. Vincent wakes up in an apartment in New York City with no recollection of having arrived there. Back in the UK, his girlfriend Emily has been murdered. Guided by mysterious phone calls which lead him to a series of clues, he soon suspects he has travelled to New York to find Emily's killer. Meanwhile, an explicit video Emily made is going viral. When she shared it with Davison in a private forum, she never expected him to upload it, but she's only ever spoken to him online, and he might be not who he says he is. Framed by footnotes and annotations written by Iki Amafar and author Steve Hollyman, Escape and Control is a metafictional murder mystery examining the loss of identity in the virtual world of the internet, a self-begetting novel for the 21st century. Gave this 1 star. Never happens because I DNF books that I feel that way about. But because it was such a quick read, and because so much of this book is based on like what the reveal is going to be, and because this book is so unknown, Usually with these type of books, I would just go look at spoilers and be like, well, that's annoying anyway, so I'm not going to carry on. But there were no spoilers online because barely anyone's read it. So I just thought, I'm just going to carry on and finish it. And there was, do you know what? With these type of books, so this has a similar framing arc to Penance, which is that the author, Steve Hollyman, includes himself as an author in the book, who's written his manuscript. His manuscript was then stolen out of his flat because it was on typewritten paper. It's stolen out of his flat. Somebody emails him months later and says, I found your manuscript, and someone has written like a book to go with it. And he's like, what the hell? So they then decide to write like a non-fiction book examining the novel written to go with his novel, and they write notes over both of them, okay? So you're reading both novels with their notes. So it's quite an odd framing narrative, but I find when you have a framing narrative like that, there can be some things about the writing or about the themes that you don't enjoy, but I find it difficult to know whether the author's doing that with intention, because they're saying, well, someone else is writing this and this person isn't a very good writer. So I sort of kept going because of that. I felt that this is from the perspective of sort of multiple men who have this, link to this woman who's been killed. And I felt that the writing about women was awful. It reminded me of a series of books I read when I was 19 at university. One of the guys I lived with recommended them to me. And do you know what? I'm so annoyed with myself because I looked them up the other day and I hadn't thought of them in all those years, and it reminded me of them. And I found out what they are. I'm going to put another picture of the first book in this series up in case anyone has heard of it. Incredibly male gazy. That was a sort of weird narrative where like it was quite drug induced and you didn't really know what was happening, and there was this weird, it was very odd. And it reminded me of that. And I kept thinking, well, maybe this is intentional and like it's, I don't know. I don't know whether the author actually felt like all the women were really flat and completely without nuance and very much just like a body part within the narrative. They were all very like, manic pixie dream girl, all very one note. And yeah, I just didn't like the overall tone. And I also guessed the sort of big reveals like really early on. So ultimately, like not even the twists were really worth it. So I really wouldn't recommend this. I'm unsure whether to go to the event now because obviously I really liked one of the books and really didn't like the other. What would you do? Then we have Before We Were Innocent by Ella Berman. This is a very recent release and again read this in one sitting. I gave this one 2 stars. This is another one I should have DNF'd. The writing wasn't bad in this, it was just completely basic. There were a couple of points where I thought she wrote about sort of the friendship of teenage girls quite well, but other than that the writing was just, sort of served its purpose. The premise of this is intriguing, although this sort of narrative has been done so many times before, so it needs to sort of in some way elevate itself above the premise, and this one just didn't. This is going to sound really harsh, but these are the type of books where I read and I think, God, like, I hear these people say they find it so hard to get published, and then you read books like this, which aren't bad, but are just so completely fine that it's like, how did something like this get published when there's these other people who have seemingly written great books and don't get published for years or never get published? It's just a bit confusing. So that sounds really mean. Premise of this is that in, I think, the present day, this woman gets a knock on the door from her ex-best friend who she hasn't seen in years. When they were teenagers, they were about 17, 18, they were on a holiday in Greece with another girl. She died and they were accused of murdering her. They were found innocent, but by the press they were viewed as guilty, and so it sort of ruined their lives. Years later, one of the girls knocks on the other one's door and says, I need you to give me an alibi to say I was here tonight. Our protagonist agrees. Absolutely no fucking reason why you'd do that. You've not seen this woman in years. You've always been a bit suspicious of her. She literally agrees because it moves the plot along. And then you sort of start to realise that a crime may have happened in the present. Clearly, the woman who asked for the fake alibi is suspicious, and then the narrative unfolds, alongside one another. So you hear about that holiday in Greece and what actually happened, and then you hear about this crime in the present day and what actually happened. What actually happened in both narratives is pretty boring. And also, God, this book could have been way stronger if it was 100 pages shorter. This is over 300 pages, and it just didn't warrant it. They're in Greece for like 7 weeks, and they're really bored and like feeling trapped in Greece and not having a good time. And God, you feel like you're bored and trapped and not having a good time as well. I was just like, just stop having these endless, like tedious chapters in Greece. Just like tell us it was tedious, and then like just get on with it, because your writing's not good enough to like justify all this. The final nail in the coffin for me with this one, and none of this is spoilery, is that our protagonist had a summer fling with the girl who died, brother, right? Does that make sense? And she was always hoping it would go somewhere. Then clearly it didn't, because his sister died and she was questioned over it. A little bit awkward to carry on a romance, right? But for all these years, she's held on to this sort of lust she had for him, and like throughout the narrative still keeps talking like they could have had this great love affair. And I was thinking, like, surely the author is going to at some point like rationalise this, that this is just so petty in the grand scheme of what's happened in these lives. And also, you barely knew him, you've not seen him in years, like, forget this guy, like, it doesn't matter. But that sort of carries on, like, right up until the end as, like, this big, epic lost love and, like, what if? And it's just like, no. Like, also, it just makes me sort of sad about, like, how there's this big story about these two groups of women, these 3 teenagers, what happened there, and then in the present day, the woman who's asking for the alibi is in a queer relationship, and so she's sort of being accused of doing something to another woman. So there's all these women in the narrative, these discussions about these interesting dynamics between women, but what, ultimately trumps and becomes the most important thing is, I really fancied this guy. So yeah, a little bit disappointed by that. And finally, we have The Three of Us by Ori Agbaje-Williams. I read this one yesterday. This is a very quick read. It's about 160 pages, I think. This is set across one day, which, as I've said, is something I really enjoy. And also it has 3 different perspectives. Premise of this is there is a wife, her husband, and her best friend, and her husband and her best friend hate one another. And so you get each of their perspectives across the course of this day, when the best friend turns up at their house and sort of outstays her welcome, and the husband gets home from work and he really doesn't want her there, and sort of the tension builds and builds, and you sort of know that there's going to be this big blow up by the end of the day. This is one of those books, like, this has got like 3.10 or something on Goodreads, which feels a bit unfair in terms of a rating, but I also sort of get it, because I can see that most people would probably give this 3 stars, because this is just like a fine read. Like, again, I will definitely watch what this author brings out in the future. I really liked how she very much set you in the present. Like, I like when an author makes references to things like the brand of crisps the characters are eating, and things that just feel really everyday and that really ground a book in reality. So there was a lot of that, which I really enjoyed. There was a lot of discussions about the sort of lives, women in particular. All these characters are Nigerian British, so the sort of spaces Nigerian women in particular can be expected to inhabit, the pressure from their parents to inhabit these roles, and how these 2 characters are sort of both failing at inhabiting those roles, but in really different ways. I thought all those discussions were really interesting, maybe sometimes a little bit heavy-handed, but I think at most points were well integrated. But I think maybe the problem with this is that the perspective you get first is the wife, and she's fairly passive, and the narrative from the husband and the best friend is that they both think they know her best. They both think they know what she wants, and it's easy for them to do that because the wife herself doesn't really talk much. So therefore she's the most interesting perspective, but you get her perspective first. So you get her perspective before the drama's really escalated. So I guess the author's done that because she wants you to decide whether the husband or the best friend are right about the wife. So she has to have the smallest voice, sort of thing. but also it just feels a bit frustrating because it feels like she's the most interesting one and she's first and then done, and then you spend time with them. So I enjoyed this. I think if you like narratives where you can sort of you disagree with everybody, but you also sort of see their point, then this is definitely a novel for you. And also this is set across the course of a day, so if you enjoy that, I would recommend this too. And I will definitely keep an eye and see what this author brings out in future. I just found this really fun and readable, and yeah, I'm glad I read it. So those are all the books I needed to catch you guys up on. I have quite a few books off my summer anticipated releases video that I have out from the library that are due in the next like 5 to 7 days. So I need to get those read, and then I should just be like hardcore booker reading. So you'll probably hear about quite a lot of new releases, as well as all the booker books, which are obviously all quite new releases as well. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. I'd love to know if you've read any of the books I've spoken about and if you have any thoughts on them. I'd also love to know what you've read in the last month or so, and if you've read anything that you would recommend. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.